All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us for our special event tonight. For those that do not know the Walden Woods Project, we are a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this April we will celebrate 36 years. This event is also sponsored by Restore the North Woods. Restore is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992 by veteran conservationists and grassroots activists. They are grassroots based, using advocacy, public education, and citizen activism to address the root causes of our ecological crisis. The mission of Restore the North Woods is to create new national parks, save natural forests, and protect endangered wildlife. So this is a Zoom webinar. You're only able to see the host and the panelists. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having tech difficulties, and I'll do my best to troubleshoot that. You can also use the chat to correspond with the presentation or with each other. And if you'd like closed captioning, you can click the live transcript or caption button on the bottom of the Zoom screen. There will be a Q&A after George's presentation, so please enter any questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And now I'll turn it over to Restore's Executive Director, Michael Kellett, who will introduce George.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very pleased to introduce George. I've known him almost 40 years. We traveled around in New England, up in the Maine woods way back when. And so George has been to a lot of other places, wild places with wolves, Alaska, Yellowstone, a lot of other places. So he's actually been there, and he's also a biologist and photographer who's visited more than 400 wilderness areas and 200 national park areas. And he worked for the Foundation for Deep Ecology for a number of years, which was a really progressive organization that led to the creation of new national parks in South America. And George was a critical part of that organization. He's now the executive director of Public Lands Media, and he was one of the founding board members of Restore the North Woods back in 1992, and he keeps getting elected as our chairperson. He can't seem to get out of that job, so we're happy that he's staying in that role for us because his insights are really important. He's also written a lot of books, 38, I think, on wildfire, protecting the wild and wilderness, and keeping wilderness areas wild. And wolves have a lot to do with all of this, of course. So it's really good that we have him talking about wolves, not only where they are now, but hopefully we can bring them back to a lot of other places, including New England and the East. So I'm going to turn it over to George. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Michael. And let me begin. I'll tell you a couple of little stories about my background. I went to school in wildlife biology at the University of Montana in Missoula, and and I had originally grown up back east. This is a little interesting thing. I was born at Buffalo Crossroads in Pennsylvania, where the last bison in Pennsylvania was killed. Uh, so a little bit of history of my growing up. But anyway, I wound up in Montana, and at the time when I started school there were no documented breeding pairs of wolves any place in the lower 48 states in the Rockies. There were wolves at that time in Minnesota in that area, but not in the Rockies. And in 1977, I was backpacking near Glacier Park in what is now known as the Great Bear Wilderness. And down the trail came what I thought was a German Shepherd. And I had just stopped to get some water. I froze, and it stopped and put its nose up in the air like it smelled something funny. And then it kind of, there wasn't anything. And then it came another 5 feet towards me and then stopped again, like it ran into a wall, and then it ran off the trail. And I went up, measured the tracks and so forth, and that was a wolf, probably a lone wolf coming down out of Canada, which did have existing wolf populations at the time. And go forward just a little bit more. In the 1980s, uh, a number of wolves came down out of Canada and started breeding in the North Fork of the Flathead River Valley by Glacier Park. And again, that was the first reproduction in Montana that was known for years, decades. And then we go a little forward, even a little bit more. And by the 1990s, there was discussion about reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone Park. And I was reading the Endangered Species Act at that time. I was living in Livingston, Montana by then. And there's a clause in there that says that you must bring about a listed species recovery immediately. And wolves were listed in 1973 under the Endangered Species Act. And so, as sort of a fun thing, I put out an announcement that I had started an organization called the National Wolf Growers Association, and that we were going to go to Canada and capture some wild wolves and release them in Yellowstone Park. And that got on NPR and newspapers and stuff like that. And and then the Fish and Wildlife Service contacted me and told me that if I did that, I would be guilty of felony charges. Uh, anyway, the long and short of it is, by the 1990s, they did introduce wolves from Canada into Yellowstone, doing exactly what I said. They captured live wolves there. So I'm going to start this talk. I'm going to focus on wolves, but predators in general have certain features that help to heal the land. So the top predators that we have well, at least in the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of my focus will be on the Rocky Mountains and west, but the implications for the east are there. So all these species were found in the east at one time: mountain lions, wolves, and black bears. Black bears are still there. Mountain lions, there's some evidence that they're moving into the new, to at least across, they're seen now in places like Michigan and so forth. And occasionally a rare animal winds up in New England that was probably just a lone traveler. And then there have been, and I'll talk about this later, some documented evidence of wolves coming into New England as well. Anyway, the media usually negatively portrays predators, particularly in the West here, and I imagine you'll see the same thing in the East, which is, the wolves or the mountain lions or whatever are killing livestock, or they're killing the deer and elk that hunters would like to shoot themselves. But they have a major role in ecosystems that are different from human hunters. Human hunters tend to select the most productive animals. The hunters want to get the bucks with the biggest racks. They select the healthy females and so forth. Whereas, to the degree, as a generalization, wolves tend to take the more vulnerable animals. That doesn't mean they won't take a prime buck or female, but in general, they go for the animals that are most vulnerable, which tend to be the young and the old. And so human hunters are not an ecological analog to predators. And also an important point is that there's no scientific evidence that hunting and predator control reduces livestock depredation or risk to humans from attacks. And because the solution they always have is, well, we had some cattle killed by wolves, we've got to go out and kill all the wolves. Or a mountain lion has attacked some person, so we've got to go and kill all the mountain lions, or at least a segment of it. And indiscriminate lethal control, particularly hunting, can exacerbate conflicts between humans and predators. And that's a really important ecological point that I'm going to get into here. So in other words, even the solution that people have, that we're going to do more hunting to control these populations, they may actually make things worse. So a couple of things. We go through some ecology. Wolves run down prey. They're not, the mountain lion uses stealth. In other words, mountain lion will try to sneak up on its prey. Wolves will tend to run them down, which means, as a rule, the wolves tend to prefer more open terrain, mountain lions more rugged, broken up terrain for hunting. So they hunt in a different way and in different terrain. So they're not exactly direct competitors. in the case of wolves, they're social hunters, and pack structure is really important. So you have, for example, usually in a situation where I'll just say elk are being attacked by a pack of wolves, like in Yellowstone. Usually the lead wolves attacking the elk will be females because they're usually smaller but faster, and the males are bigger and heavier. And then once the females get the elk slowed down, then the males who are heavier and bigger can come in and try to pull down that elk. And so that, the individual, you might say, chores or roles of different animals is partially responsible for pack success. And of course, young are raised by the entire pack. So usually there's a dominant male and female that have pups, and the rest of the pack helps feed them. The main preys of wolves are large ungulates in the West. That would be elk and deer. But in some parts of the country, beaver are also a major prey for wolves, like in the upper Midwest, like Minnesota and so forth. In the summertime, 25% of their diet comes from beaver. And I did a trip a couple of years ago in the Boundary Waters canoe area, and I found a bunch of places. It was kind of cool where beaver were dragging logs down a beach into the water, and here were wolf tracks, right there. I didn't see any evidence that they were successful at getting the beaver, but they were obviously keyed into that. And there's an ecological effect. The wolves are called top-down predators and affect ecosystem function at many levels. And the trophic cascade effect is where the predator, whether it's a wolf or a mountain lion or whatever, affects the influences the prey as well as smaller predators. So, for example, in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, once wolves came back there, the density and number of coyotes declined. And the reason is because wolves kill coyotes. So the wolves take over a certain amount of territory. They basically exclude the coyotes from that territory. And so they reduce those number of coyotes. And then what's interesting is that affects other things. For example, pronghorn out in the West, fawn survival is affected by coyotes because they're a major predator on pronghorn. And so in areas where there were wolves, there were 4 times higher fawn survival of pronghorn because of the reduced predation from coyotes. Another effect was fewer coyotes led to more fox, and this is really interesting. I've been going to Yellowstone Park for decades now, and when I first was spending my time there, it was really rare to see a fox. And now, I won't say I see them every day or anything like that, but it's not an unusual sighting to see foxes today, partly again because the coyote population has declined. So you have this thing, wolves will kill coyotes and coyotes will kill fox. So if the wolves kill the coyotes, there's less coyotes to kill the foxes. And also the foxes, not being anybody's fool, tend to den near the wolves because the wolves don't kill foxes as a rule. And so they use the wolves as sort of their safety area for denning and producing pups. But there's other things like areas near wolf dens have more rodents. Again, because for the most part, the wolves don't bother with the rodents. They got bigger animals in mind. And so rodents increase there. And they found that raptors like golden eagles and hawks and so forth prefer or at least tend to hunt more by wolf denning sites and areas because there's usually more rodents there. So that's some of that cascading effect that we talk about. But another thing is that they can reduce disease in animals like elk. For example, there's a disease in the Yellowstone area called brucellosis, which causes cattle to abort their first calf. And it's a big issue out west. Is one of the reasons why bison are shot when they come out of Yellowstone Park, because the livestock industry is fearful that brucellosis will get transmitted. But anyway, the wolves select for animals that are diseased and also disperse them. And since brucellosis is partly spread by density, and if the animals like elk are spread out, they're less likely to have brucellosis. And so that's another effect of the presence of of wolves in Yellowstone. Another effect is just the habitat used by elk and deer. But the elk avoided wolves where wolf activity was centered around den sites by selecting higher elevations, less open habitat, more burnt forest, and areas of steeper slope. Now, why would they select the elk? That is, why would they select things like burnt forest and steeper slopes? Because if you remember, at the beginning I said wolves tend to run down their prey. Well, the wolves have a harder time capturing elk if they have to jump over down logs, if they have to be running up and down steep slopes and so forth. So their way to avoid predation is to just change their habitat. Another thing that's been documented in Yellowstone to a degree, and there's a lot of controversy about this. I won't go into all of it, but one of the things that has been documented to a degree is that the herbivory or predation of elk and deer on aspen was affecting the regeneration of younger aspen groves. And since wolves have been brought back, there has been greater regeneration of aspen. Now, some of that people attribute to the fact that there are lower numbers of elk in Yellowstone today than there used to be, partly because the elk have moved and become more distributed outside of the park, besides just in the park, but also no doubt because there is this tendency to avoid the wolves by staying in the higher elevations and away from where the aspen are most abundant. So this is a good example of a chart that shows aspen regeneration on the Gallatin River in Montana, and from 1880 to 1920, and you can see there was a lot of aspen regeneration in the 1880s and early 1900s, and then it declined significantly through the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And then in 1990, and wolves were introduced in 1994 and 5 in Yellowstone, there started to be some regeneration. And one thing to keep in mind too, that the regeneration of aspen in the 1880s and so forth could have also been affected by things like climate as well, which was wetter and cooler back then. And we're suffering more from drought today. Anyway, the reduction of browsing on willows in the Lamar Valley, these are the willows out in the foreground here, that used to be just like about knee high. And now they're getting, as you can see, much higher. And with the recovery of willows, you have a lot of songbirds that nest in those willows. So that's one of the cascade effects. Some even hypothesize that the predators help to ameliorate the effects of climate change, because in the past, like in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, it was colder and more snow in Yellowstone than today because of climate warming. So, and that has to go with the drought conditions that I mentioned too. And that used to kill a lot of elk every winter, and that provided a lot of food for grizzly bears and so forth, coyotes and all that. Well, now the wolves are back. They create carrion that provides these other animals with a late winter source of food. And in fact, when a grizzly bear comes out of hibernation, particularly a sow with cubs, and she finds a wolf killed buffalo or elk, that's like winning the lottery. Because when they come out, there's not much for them to eat, and they're not particularly good at capturing a large animal like an elk. They can capture calves pretty well, but they're not born until May, and they come out of hibernation in March and April, and there's not much to eat. So they find a dead elk or a dead bison. That's a significant bit of food. And then you have other scavengers too, like ravens and so forth, magpies that benefit. And even and I mentioned the grizzlies coming out of hibernation can increase their survival. This grizzly cub. So what happened? We started a war on predators with you guys in Massachusetts were the first ones. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 created the first wolf bounty in in North America, I guess, and what became the United States. And that carried on across the country. So by the time settlers on the Oregon Trail got to Oregon, one of the very first political actions were what they called wolf meetings. And the first one was held in 1843 and levied a $5 assessment. That was a lot of money back then on each settler to pay for bounties on predators like wolves. So, right from the beginning, we were always trying to kill off these wolves because they were seen as competition. And because of that, the range of wolves shrank significantly. This upper chart on the right-hand side, the gray shows the historic range of the gray wolf. And notice that there was none in the southeast. That was the range of the red wolf, is another species that I'm not going to get into here. But basically, the gray wolf was found in parts of California, but not all of California, but most of the rest of the West and across the Midwest, and of course into New England. And then the population, the lower left corner, you can hardly see it, but there's a little bit of gray in the top of Minnesota, and that's that's where they were by 1974 when they got listed under the Endangered Species Act. So there were always wolves left in Minnesota, but no place else. And then the next lower right-hand corner shows the Rocky Mountains expansion of wolves in the upper Midwest, and then the Mexican wolf down in Arizona and New Mexico. So historical references. Lewis and Clark recorded wolves were present at the mouth of the Columbia River where they wintered in 1805. And in 1830, the naturalist John Kirk Townsend visited the Hudson's Bay post at Fort Vancouver across the Columbia River from present-day Portland, noted a trapper brought in an enormous wolf. Another early settler in the Oregon's Willamette Valley stated that deers and wolves were the most numerous game animals in that area. And the point of all this is to show that wolves were quite abundant when the first settlers arrived. And the Hudson's Bay Company had a fort and trading post on the Columbia River. And between 1827 and 1859, they bought more than 7,761 wolves in Oregon Territory. And at that time, Oregon Territory was much more than Oregon. It included Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So that's actually not a lot of wolves given the time period, but still, you can see it's not insignificant either. But today, we have a different attitude. Wolf watching has become a really big thing in Yellowstone. People just get so excited to see wolves there and other places where wolves are found. In Alaska, Denali Park is a good place to see wolves. There are also wolves now down in, of course, the Grand Teton National Park and in other parts of the West. The problem is where it's denser vegetation, like the boundary waters in Minnesota or up in Glacier, it's much more difficult to see wolves there because it's dense forest. So the wolves were listed endangered in 1973, and natural wolf recovery occurred in the northern Rockies by Glacier in the 1980s, and wolves were introduced into Idaho and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem 1995 and 96 as experimental. Now the whole thing is just to me, it was a clever ruse. Experimental meant that they could shoot wolves that they considered problematic. And that was to sort of allay the concerns of ranchers. But the wolves that were up by Glacier Park were considered protected under the Endangered Species Act. But it turned out they could be shot too. So it didn't really confer much difference in the way that the wolves were managed in either place. And this is a map just kind of showing you the general locations of Glacier Park is up near the Canadian border. You can see Yellowstone in the right-hand lower side, and the River No Return Wilderness is on the western side of this circle. And from that original introductions and stuff, wolves have moved out. So there's an arrow up near the top there that shows wolves going over into Washington State, and there are now several hundred wolves in Washington State. Wolves also swam the Snake River and into Oregon, and now there's several hundred wolves in Oregon. And from Oregon, wolves moved down into California. So there has been this dispersal from these original populations. So here's a general population statistics, and these vary a little bit, but give you an idea. In Michigan, 750 wolves, Wisconsin, 1,000, Minnesota, almost 3,000 wolves. and Northern Rocky Mountain population about 1,000 in Montana, 1,100 in Idaho. Wyoming has only 350. Eastern Oregon about 200, Washington about 230, and right now California has about 50 wolves. And Arizona, Mexican wolves has about 120 in Arizona and 160 in New Mexico. And that seems like wolves are doing pretty good, and they are. But given the area we're talking about, I mean, the fact that just look at the statistics, the Northern Rocky Mountain population in Washington, Oregon, there's still more wolves in just Minnesota alone than in that whole huge area out west. And what's that about? Well, they kill them quicker here in the west than they do in Minnesota. And this is a somewhat of an older chart. I don't remember what year this is from. Each one of these circles shows you a wolf pack. And you can see Western Montana particularly has a lot of wolf packs. And there's quite a few around Yellowstone there in the northwest corner of Wyoming and then down into central Idaho. And each one of those packs, they can vary from a pack is just 2 adults and some pups. So, it's hard to say what the total population is there. Anyway, there have been lots of lawsuits over wolves. In August, the federal district court in Missoula ruled that the Fish and Wildlife Service violated the Endangered Species Act when it determined that gray wolves in the western U.S. do not warrant federal protection. There was the Fish and Wildlife Service, because they have under pressure from states like Montana, like Wyoming, like Idaho, and so forth, pressure to delist wolves so that the states can manage them. So they've gone in and out of legal limbo. Sometimes they're protected, sometimes they're not. But as I suggested, the protection often doesn't matter that much. So anyway, we hear how wolves are destroying elk herds. Ranchers have had wolves imposed upon them. The ranchers are victimized. I'll talk about that in a little bit. How do we frame an issue affects how we perceive the controversy. Many of the conflicts are created by predator management, which I mentioned at the earlier part, and I'll get into that a little bit. 2 groups that are opposed to wolf recovery are ranchers and hunters. You don't have to deal with the ranchers back in New England much, but maybe some farmers, but mostly you're going to hear from hunters there. Here we have both. Management of wolf is about control. The anger and intensity of feelings around wolf frustration is more about control. Who controls wildlife than the real impacts that wolves have on livestock or prey. And you hear this stuff all the time. Why don't we just manage predators like other wildlife, like deer? Well, predators are different. And a couple of things. I don't know if I get to it in the talk here, but I'm going to mention it right now. The amount of livestock killed annually, for example, in a state like Montana, is 50 to 100 cattle, and they might lose 15,000 to poison plants or something. In other words, the effect of wolves on livestock population is pretty insignificant. I think I have stuff about that later, but just to make that point. There's an assertion that wolves can maintain a 25 to 50% mortality without biological consequences, but that doesn't look at the ecological and social interactions, the social ecology of these animals. Cultural knowledge is essential to survival. So if you're killing off 50% of the wolves and you're taking out a lot of the adults that know where the elk calve or where the wildlife migration corridors are, or where to avoid getting into trouble with people, that knowledge gets eliminated when you kill a large pack, and it creates unstable social systems. And as a result, the pack members might be more prone to attack livestock or wander into new territories that they don't know very well. And if they don't know the territory well and where the wildlife is, then they may be more likely to take livestock or somebody's dog in their backyard. So you get the idea. So you break up that social cohesion. So even though they can produce a lot of pups, population-wise, you're still affecting their overall ability of survival. So predator control creates a self-fulfilling feedback where livestock owners and hunters demand greater predator control, and hunters and so forth are encouraged to kill more predators, disrupting the social organization. One of the effects is if you have a lot of mortality, you tend to skew the population of younger animals, which in turn are more likely to kill livestock leading to ever more demands for predator control. I mean, the younger animals, it's said that it takes up to about 3 years before a wolf is really an efficient hunter. So if you are constantly killing the predators, you change the population to younger animals, which in turn are not as very good at hunting, so they're more likely to take something easy like livestock. Um, so that's one of the social effects. So I want to use this example of populations because fish and game departments and others just go on populations, but they don't look at the demographic makeup of those populations, which really affects the ability of the animals to survive. And this is true for bears, this is true for mountain lions, and so forth. Um, Age and population traits. So you can have 20 wolves, for example, and you can have 4 packs with 5 wolves per pack with 2 adults and 3 pups in each. So you have a total of 12 pups. Okay, so you got your 20 wolves. Or if you have a lot of wolf mortality, uh, you can, I mean, without a lot of wolf mortality, you can have 20 wolves in 1 pack with 15 adults and subadults and only 5 pups. So why is that important? Well, because when you have more pups, for one thing, pups need a lot of food. So you got to kill more prey. Plus, if you only got 2 adults to capture food, they're much more likely to, again, to take the easy food like livestock and so forth. And they can't defend their territory against a big pack either. So they're marginalized into the less efficient or the lower prey base habitat. And this is what happens when you disrupt this social thing. So you still the social thing. You have a 20 wolves in each of these scenarios, but the demographics different, and that really makes a difference of how they can provide for each other. And by the way, younger age structure is also another feature. Young wolves, particularly young males, are like young teenage boys. They are not as careful about what they do. They're more bold. They're more likely to strike out and get into new territory that they don't know real well. And therefore, if the opportunity exists, they're more likely to take livestock. So packs with mostly 2 adults and overall young age would be more inclined to take livestock. So that's my point. And then this is the point about takes 3 years for a wolf to fully become an efficient hunter. And I mentioned the different roles in hunts with the smaller females chase the prey down, the larger, heavier, but slower males pull them down. So the social disruption of wolf packs is very important. And this is one of the reasons why predator control actually makes things worse. After a hunting ban was instituted outside of Algonquin Park in Ontario, the park instituted human-caused mortality decreased, but largely offset by natural mortality, such that wolf density remained at the same constant. However, the number of wolf packs with unrelated adopted animals decreased from 80% to 6%, indicating a much more stable social organization. Again, the social ecology with no mortality, without hunting and predator control, is way different in those kind of wolf packs. And another thing is state agencies often maintain lower populations of prey to appease ranchers. Well, that indirectly affects wolves and other predators. So a lot of parts of Montana and other parts of the West, I'm most familiar with Montana, the Fish and Game has what they call population objectives. And the population objectives are often below what the biological carrying capacity of that land is, because if they allowed the biological capacity to be reached, the ranchers would complain about too many elk or deer feeding in their haystacks, etc. So they maintain the elk at their political rather than biological carrying capacity, which means there's less food for predators like elk and mountain lions and so forth to utilize. Now, one of the things that I like to make the point is livestock producers have externalized one of their costs as much as a factory used to externalize their costs by air pollution. We are saying you must internalize those costs. So, for example, you'll hear this thing that the wolves have been imposed on the livestock. Well, I say it's the other way around. The livestock have been imposed on the predators. So you have a whole bunch of ways livestock negatively impacts predators. One is social displacement of prey animals. For better or for worse, the elk and deer don't like to be around cows. So when you have a lot of cows come onto an area, the elk and deer split and go someplace else. And if that was an area that the wolf had been hunting in, suddenly there's no elk or deer to eat, and it's been replaced by these cattle. So what do? They might feed on the cattle. Also, every blade of grass going into a cow is much less forage for elk and bison and other herbivores. And then you put predator control. Livestock are imposed on wolves. Wolves are killed. If a wolf killed the exotic animal, like a cow or sheep, even on public lands, we kill the predators. And this is where I disagree with some of these wolf advocacy groups. They'll go out with uh, firecrackers and other things on public lands where there's sheep and cattle being grazed, and they'll try to scare the wolves away so they won't prey on the livestock. And I'm like, no, you should be scaring the livestock away, not scaring the wolves, which should be there on our public lands, not the livestock. Anyway, and the last thing is overgrazing has reduced the productivity of many Western lands, so it can't support as many elk and deer and so forth as it used to. Um, Animal husbandry practices can reduce these predator opportunities and problems, but they cost more. And so, unless they're forced to do it, a lot of times ranchers don't want to do that. But guard dogs work, nighttime corralling, barn use, all these things work better than just putting them out there. What happens a lot of times in the West, the cattle and sheep are put out for weeks at a time with nobody out there looking after them. And then, the wolves discover some, kill some, and then we go kill the wolves. In places like Europe, wolf predation was reduced by confining and gathering sheep at night with livestock guarding dogs. And those practices could prevent most kills, 94% to 79% respectively, that would have occurred with free ranging sheep. So that's just one thing, but it costs more money to have a sheep herd. It costs more money to gather them at night. Another way that livestock contributes to the problem for livestock producers is that carrion attracts new attacks. A review of livestock in Europe found that depredated farms were 55 times higher risk for repeat predation within 12 months. So what happens is the dead animals, if they're left out there, they attract in things like wolves. They get used to feeding on livestock, and then they're more likely to attack livestock in the future. So here's a chart showing some interesting statistics. This was, I forget what year it was, but it's basically the same every year. The point I'm trying to show here is the verified losses from wolves. In Idaho, it was 75 animals, in Montana, 87, and in Wyoming, 26. Okay, 87 out of 2,000 in Montana, 2,550, roughly 2 million, 2,550,000 livestock, and only 87 losses. Other sources of loss and mortality were 80,000. So as a comparison, it shows you that the wolves really aren't a big deal, but it is something that the ranchers feel they can control, and so that's why they want to eliminate them. And there's another interesting statistic. Domestic dogs kill more cattle than wolves, at least in the West. And this only basically 1% of all cattle losses were due to wolf predation. In this particular year, it was 2005. Domestic dogs killed 5 times as many cattle in that same year. So again, are wolves really a problem? And then here's again, source of mortality in Idaho. Digestive problems, 23,000. Respiratory disease, 16,000. Birthing problems, 9,000. Go down the list, and all predators is 2,500. And I don't know in this particular year how many wolves were responsible for, but some subset of that. So it's, again, not the big problem that's made to be. So in 2010, Idaho cattle producers lost 93,000 animals in all causes. Total cattle losses were 75. Why are they at war with wolves? It's a psychological thing. If you're a rancher or a farmer, you're always fighting the elements, and you don't have control over things like drought. You don't have control over harsh winters with deep snow that kill your animals. You don't have control over poison plants, but you think you have control over wolves. So this is why the focus on wolves. It's just a scapegoat that you can blame and hopefully you think control. In Minnesota, they have depredation requirements. The following conditions apply when taking action to destroy a wolf. In other words, before a wolf is allowed to be killed, the farmer or dog owner must report the action to authorized agent within 24 hours. The agent will investigate and keep written and photographic documentation of the kill site and any instances of poor husbandry that contribute to the attack occurring. With farmers, but not dog owners, evaluate what, if any, best management practices and non-lethal controls are needed to prevent future attacks, and develop a written and signed plan with the farmer for implementation. And so if they have a depredation, they have to practice new practices so they get less problems there. Another thing you have that I disagree with, there's all these groups that talk about predator-friendly livestock, because some rancher or farmer says they're not going to kill predators, and it's usually some hobby farmer that doesn't have very many livestock anyway and doesn't rely on it. But we'll put that aside. There's no free lunch because those animals are eating the same food, that is, the livestock is eating the same food that would support native animals. Like your elk and deer. And so you're taking food out of the mouth of the animals that the predators rely on. And then I mentioned earlier the social displacement. So when cows come onto an area, the elk leave. That's another, whether it's predator friendly or not, that's another impact. And then you have this whole thing about how the elk and deer populations are going to be decimated for hunting. So in 1992, 3 years before wolves were introduced into Yellowstone in central Idaho, Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks estimated the elk herd was 89,000. Today, with 1,100 wolves in the state, there are now 170,000 elk. And I sort of jokingly say to these hunters that are complaining, you guys, you just need more wolves. You'll have more elk and deer. It's a little more complicated why this has happened, but it's a fact that all the states, Wyoming, Idaho, etc., we've seen exactly the same thing. And then you hear about declining elk herds, and this is statistics from Montana. Female elk numbers meet or exceed objectives in 23 of the 29 elk management zones. They're below objectives in 6 zones. And bull elk meet or exceed objectives in 20 zones and are below objectives in 9 zones. Overall, hunter success is around 20%, which is considered pretty good. So the point is that there's not declining elk herds. And this map shows the pink are areas that are over quote objectives. The green things are okay, and then you see the blue is Indian reservations, and the yellow is where they're a little below. And hunters, as I mentioned earlier, tend to kill the prime condition mature bulls. So they have a different effect, and they have a different ecological effect on all this. And you can see wolves are much less likely to take reproductive female. Here's one I photographed in Yellowstone, a bunch of elk. 1 elk and 3 wolves. They tried to get this female, but were unable to, she stood her ground, they gave up and moved on. So hunting and trapping are the main cause of wolf mortality. In 2021, 25 wolves from Yellowstone were killed when they ventured outside the park boundary. That's approximately 20% of the wolves in the park. And they usually get killed within a day or two. This will be a point I'll get to later about protecting. And hunter selection is different from predators. Hunters remove the most productive and fit animals from a population. So what's the solution? One, for Yellowstone, I think we should make a 23 million acre Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem National Park, because national parks don't allow hunting. And to have one large area where wolves aren't constantly being killed like that could be really significant. We don't have anything that big any place in our whole country, even up in Alaska. We don't have any protected areas that large. So if we want to minimize predator effect on prey population, automatically eliminating the trophic cascade influence of predators. So this whole idea, if we reduce the wolf populations, we still have maybe some wolves left, but we are affecting that trophic cascade. So you're really affecting the evolution of things. All right, in February 2022, court ordered gray wolves in the contiguous 48 states in Mexico, with the exception of northern Rocky Mountain population, in other words, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, were protected under the Endangered Species Act and threatened in Minnesota. And the eastern wolf was recognized as a separate species in Canada, not the US. And then Trump reversed the decision in 2024. Biden had announced that it would develop a nationwide gray wolf recovery plan by 2025. Trump administration reversed the decision based on the results of the species status reviews completed in 2020, when the agency previously determined the species should be delisted back when he was president before. Okay, are there wolves in the Northeast? So now I'm going to move over here. In September 1993, a gray wolf was shot and killed near Moosehead Lake in Maine and confirmed the animal as a wolf. Another possible wolf was trapped and killed near Bangor, Maine in 1996. In November 1998, a wolf was shot and killed in Grover, Vermont. In December 2000, a wolf was shot in Day, New York. In April 2001, a wolf was shot and killed in Sterling, New York. In 2005, canid scat was collected near Rangeley, Maine. It was identified as gray wolf DNA. October 1st, 2006, hunter shot and killed a wolf near Sherburne, Massachusetts. In a 2023 video, there was claiming to be an adult wolf and young was filmed in northern Maine. This is by Greenwood on Moosehead Lake, there's a picture. An 85-pound wolf was killed in New York in 2021 by a deer hunter in the Adirondacks. And so there are wolves that are naturally moving back into New England and New York State. At this point, we have no evidence of a breeding population, just like the early days in Montana when the first wolves were being sighted, including the one that I saw in 1977. So it's very typical to have roaming females and males, especially young ones, out looking around for another mate. But how would they do there? Well, there's plenty of prey. New York has 1.2 million deer. Maine has 320,000 deer. Pennsylvania has up to 1.5 million deer. Massachusetts has 150,000 deer. Vermont has 140,000 deer. New Hampshire, 100,000 deer. So we're talking about a huge amount of prey base. And to give you some concept of the size of these things, Vermont is about 6 million acres. Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. So Vermont is about 3 times the size of Yellowstone Park. And I'll tell you that the wolves do fine in Yellowstone Park, and they have less prey than would be in Vermont, for example. And then there's other prey that is also found in New England. I don't know how many beaver you have or moose, but there are also alternative prey species. So then people say, well, there's too many people in New England. That's a lame excuse. Italy has 60 million people and has 3,300 wolves. And just by comparison, Montana has 1 million humans and only 1,000 wolves. So human population isn't necessarily a reason, as long as they got a sufficient prey base. And currently, all Northeast states consider wolves to be extirpated, so they have no special regulation to protect wolves that occasionally appear in the area. The Eastern Wolf Status Report, prepared for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011, concluded sizable areas of potential wolf habitat exist in New York. One study suggests New York could support up to 460 wolves in 2000 if they were to get back. So one of the ways that you can make things favorable for wolves is by having parks and other protected preserves where hunting and trapping doesn't happen. And one of the things that Restore has done and is proposed for a 3.2 million acre national park in the Maine woods. If this were to be established, this would be plenty of habitat to sustain viable wolf populations in Maine into the future. So what can you do? You can join and support groups advocating for wolf recovery like Restore, pressure state wildlife agencies to enact regulations to protect wolves. For example, trapping and hunting of coyotes should be terminated because a lot of the wolves that get killed, quote, are accidentally shot thinking they're coyotes or trapped. Protect roadless areas, since most human mortality occurs along roads, and the single greatest impact on wolves out west is human mortality. And designate large habitat forests like national parks where no wolves are allowed. So here's my final concluding remarks. Predators are critical for healthy ecosystems. They're not like other wildlife. You don't manage them the same way. Their social structure is very important, and predator control, disrupts, and hunting disrupts that social structure. You should manage for social stability to reduce conflicts, and we need to take back wolf management from state agencies, which have a conflict of interest because they're promoting animals for hunters to shoot. That's it. Okay. Ready for questions?
Awesome. Thank you, George. We have lots of questions, so I'm just going to jump right in. Why aren't wolves killing foxes?
Why aren't they? They just don't see them as competition, but they see coyotes as competition. So they just don't bother. It's just not worth their time. That's all.
Yeah. And 700 wolves in Michigan, that must be in the northern peninsula.
Yes,
Michigan.
most of the wolves are in the northern peninsula, and you can see the gradient from Wisconsin, which has the most. Minnesota has the most, and Wisconsin has a lesser amount, and then finally Michigan. But that is, the wolf populations have been expanding in Wisconsin and in Michigan, so that may be just a factor. It's taking longer for them to disperse and get there.
And the eastern coyote is said to be part wolf by DNA. If
Right.
wolves get near, should we expect these coyotes to acquire even more wolf DNA and become more like wolves?
It's hard for me to say. I think the reason the coyotes have wolf DNA is because you have these small populations of wolves, and then they're ready to breed, so they breed with whoever they can get, and it tends to be the coyotes. So if you have viable wolf populations, I mean, in Yellowstone, the wolves don't breed with coyotes; they kill them. So I think if you have a sufficient population base, you'll see less of that breeding, and you may see over time the two of them getting more and more differentiated. In other words, wolves will stay more wolves, coyotes will just be breeding with other coyotes, and then the wolf factor will be declining as a percentage of their DNA.
What determines which wolves are collared in Yellowstone, and what about the percentage of wolves are collared?
I don't know the answer to the second question, what percentage are collared, but generally, my understanding is usually at least one pack member of each pack is they collar to try to keep track of them. The one of the things that happened when they had 25 wolves killed that one year is Yellowstone's one of the longest ongoing wolf research projects, and one of the few places where wolves aren't automatically killed. I'm gonna switch here to coyotes for a second, but a friend of mine studied coyotes in Yellowstone, and he found that the coyotes there acted a lot like wolves. In other words, they had bigger packs. They weren't just couples of one or two wolves breeding. They had pack structure just like wolves and so forth. And yet every place else that anybody's ever studied coyotes, they talk about how there's just one or there'd be a couple, and then they never have other coyotes that they interact with and so forth. They don't form packs. And his conclusion, that's because every place else the coyotes are shot and trapped and poisoned, and their social structure is constantly disrupted. What I'm trying to get back at is that that killing of 25 wolves that particular year really upset the social construction of the wolves in Yellowstone, and disrupted some of the research because now we didn't have this population that was not suffering high human mortality.
Right. In New England, moose populations are growing and spreading south and west. Would wolves hunt down adult moose or just prey on their calves?
Well, just like everything, they tend to go for the easy, and so calves are going to be the focus. But one of the things that happens when you have a bigger prairie like moose, you actually, and this has to do with bison too, the wolf packs that prey on bison or moose tend to be larger because it takes more wolves to pull down a big animal like a moose. But so you might expect in some areas, especially if the primary prey that's available is moose, you might find them specializing in taking down primarily moose, but be larger packs. For example, Wood Buffalo National Park in Alberta, their wood buffalo bison are there, and they're a big animal, and the average size of a wolf pack there's like 15 to 20, because that's how big they have to be to successfully take down bison. Whereas in Minnesota, they're mostly feeding on white-tailed deer, and a lot of the wolf packs are quite a bit smaller. The 4 or 5 is sufficient to bring down white-tailed deer.
What is the closest wild wolf population to New England? Is there a chance wolves might return to New England on their own?
Well, there are wild wolves in Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, which I don't know the exact distance that is, maybe 100, 150 miles, maybe. And then there's dispersers outside of it. Algonquin, it protects its wolves, but there are wolves in Quebec, north of the border. But the thing you got to remember is they kill wolves in Canada too. So they have this whole gauntlet. The wolves coming out of more northern places. The Canadian border is the most densely near the U.S. border is the most densely populated part of Canada. So you got the most towns, you got the most roads, the most sources of mortality are there. So for a wolf from north of that major population zone to get through that filter of all those roads and houses and people out, hunters and so forth, it's you got to be pretty lucky. But some are doing it, as the evidence of some of these wolves that have shown up in the area have. The question is how long will it take before uh, there's a breeding population? And then when you do get a breeding population, are they going to be protected? Like California is a good example. They recently, I don't know, first wolves were sighted there maybe 10 years ago or something like that. But California is very strict. They've given wolves a lot of protection there. Um, and they there's lots of pressure to kill wolves because of livestock depredation and so forth. But it, it, they don't. They in Montana, if wolves kill one cow, they right away take out the pack. Practically. Whereas in some places like California, they might allow a wood pack to kill 3 or 4 livestock before they do anything. So how a state reacts when wolves get established makes a big difference on how quickly they can repopulate an area. They can produce a lot of pups, uh, but what percentage of pups survive to adulthood depends a lot on the kind of both the prey base that's there as well as what the state management is. And that's why trying to get states to, like Colorado just recently, they're doing a reintroduction of wolves. This is an idea. They had a referendum in Colorado. Should we try to recover wolves? And the population said yes. The majority of people in the state voted yes. So Colorado has embarked on restoring wolves. Uh, it wasn't the Fish and Game wanted to do that. It wasn't the ranchers that wanted to do that. But the voters said, yeah, we want that. So they're embarked on it, and they're having some issues because this is typical. Trump administration, they were getting wolves from Canada, and Trump administration has now made it illegal for Colorado to transport wolves from Canada to Colorado. So, that's a federal thing. So even if you had good state, efforts, they still might be squashed by the current administration. But that hopefully won't be in power for too long.
You might have
Okay.
answered this one just
Yeah.
now, but can you talk about the successful activist efforts to reintroduce wolves to Colorado that started in the late 1980s and resulted in there now being an active wolf population in the Rockies as of a few years ago?
Yeah, well, basically what I said, they got a referendum that passed voters and directing the Fish and Game to reintroduce wolves. And the first wolves were obtained from other states, like from I forget which states they went to get them from, but I think they got a few from Oregon, and they were trying to get some from Washington just recently, and they got turned down. And at the same time, so they were turning to Canada, and then, as I said, the Trump administration has made it illegal to bring in wolves from Canada. And they're having the same thing. Wolves are killing livestock there, so they wind up getting, some of them get killed. And then there's opposition from different constituents, like the Ute Indian tribe doesn't want any wolves in Colorado, so their reservation takes up a large part of good wolf habitat. And if a wolf wanders onto the Ute reservation, they got to capture it or kill it. One of the two, they have to capture it and move it out. But there's a lot of good habitat in Colorado. And one of the things that's interesting, Colorado, here's a statistic: Colorado has 300,000 elk. Montana has 170, like I mentioned. So Colorado has double the prey base of large ungulates like elk that Montana does. So there's no reason why they wouldn't do well there. And the climate's a little milder in Colorado too, by the way, than Montana. I think that there's some lessons to be learned there in terms of what to do. Now, some people are opposed to any introduction of. The argument is that if they get there naturally, like what happened in Oregon or California, supposedly that reduces the antagonism that ranchers and hunters have. I can report from my experience in Oregon that's not true. they don't like having them here regardless of how they got here. But that's one of the arguments given against moving them, trapping them in Canada or wherever, and getting a source like that. And that's what they were planning to do in Colorado. Now I don't know what's going to happen, because they don't seem to have a source of wolves to get right now, and they might have to get by with the. I don't know what the total population is in Colorado right now, but it's not very big. But that might be it for a while.
Yeah. How feasible is it to distinguish between a pure wolf and a coy wolf?
Well, I have no experience with the coy wolf, so I can't tell you. But there are a couple of things that, and I don't know if this is true, Congress, but in the West, one of the sure ways of knowing you're looking at a wolf versus a coyote is that one is about 50% of the wolves in Yellowstone are black. So if you see a black, and that goes for the rest, Montana and Idaho, Wyoming. So if you see what looks like a black dog out there, you can pretty much sure it's a wolf. Gray animals are also pretty common. Occasionally there are white wolves, but mostly when they're gray, then they can look a little bit more like a coyote. But one of the things that's really interesting when you see a wolf in the wild is it's got big paws. They're like 5 inches or more across, and compared to a coyote, and they have a sort of a broader, bigger face, and jaws, and so forth. But if you see them at a distance, you can misidentify them. One time I was camped in the Beartooth Mountains northeast of Yellowstone, and right at Timberline, this guy comes over in the morning. He says, "Did you see the wolves last night?" "No, we didn't see the wolves." And he said, "Oh, they came right up to my tent, 2 white wolves." I said, "Oh, really?" So I said, "Well, where did you see them?" And he told me, and I went over to look around. I didn't see any wolf tracks, but it was real rocky and so forth, so possible. And so I came back. He was still talking to my wife at the time, and he said, "So did you see anything?" I said, "Well, the only thing I saw were mountain goat tracks, but I didn't see any wolf tracks." But so what? So then the next night, next day, he comes back. He says, "They came back again last night." He said, "They were mountain goats." And the reason I tell this story is if you want to see wolves, I can tell you all the time, when wolves weren't around Yellowstone, people were constantly telling me they were seeing wolves, and mostly what they were seeing were coyotes or mountain goats, maybe. So it's easy to misidentify the animals, especially at a distance, and you have no size comparison and other features that you can see well. And just to give one more example of my own embarrassing situation, I was one time up on the Arctic coast in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and I'm sitting there out on the tundra, and I'm looking around with binoculars, and I spotted 2 grizzly bears with their backs to me. And I was very excited, a little nervous too, because they weren't that far away. And I'm watching the bears, and here comes a snowy owl. So I'm watching the snowy owl, and it flew right over the grizzly bears. And the snowy owl was bigger than the grizzly bears because they were 2 ground squirrels. So, but had I not seen that snowy owl, I would have told everybody, "Well, we saw 2 grizzly bears right there in the Arctic coast." So you can kind of, when you want to see something, sometimes I guess that's why people still see Sasquatch all over the West. If you really want to see something, you can make other things into it.
Definitely. Um, And we'll just do a few more. If New England habitat is viable, why aren't they filled with wolves? Coy wolves are successful.
Um, why aren't they filled with wolves? Because it's taken, they were extirpated, and takes takes, you have a lot of lone animals from the evidence of individuals that are getting shot there or trapped there, but you don't have a breeding population. And especially when any population is getting started, it's very slow growth at first. And, and, especially if there's high human mortality, that's what's preventing it. But the things are, they're getting better in New England. There's been this, our whole thing with Restore is that a lot of the, things that used to disrupt forest ecosystems, like the logging industry, the farming, all that's declined. 80% of Vermont, I used to live in Vermont, 80% of Vermont was the forest was eliminated back in the 1800s. And so all sorts of animals went extinct there. And, and there was even no white-tailed deer in Vermont back in the 1880s. And, there's deer there now, there's moose there now, there's even lynx have been seen there, there's martin, there's fisher. All these species were gone and have come back with the forest coming back. And so this, in a sense, this natural regeneration that's going on, or proforestation that's going on around New England, is creating habitat where you have a better chance for wolves to survive. And again, the biggest thing is the human mortality. There's plenty of prey base. And so what's the mortality amount? You need security habitat, like places where hunting and trapping isn't allowed. And there's less human intrusions. There's like not as many logging roads can be. Out west, the wolves that get killed are mostly getting shot along. Guys are driving around in their pickup trucks on logging roads or dirt roads, and they see a wolf, they jump out with their rifle and they shoot it, or they set traps along those roads. So reducing the road network, allowing forest cover to come back, uh, provides the security that is the most important thing. There's plenty of things for wolves to eat back there. It's just a matter of getting some security from human mortality.
Awesome. And not to end on a bad note, but the last question, has there ever been any documented instance of a human killed by wolves in the United States?
In the United States, I'm not sure. There was one person killed up in Canada a number of years ago by a wolf that was habituated at a garbage dump. And um, I don't know the circumstance around there, but it wasn't, quote, a wild wolf anymore in the sense that it was used to being around humans. Um, but I will tell a story about that too. My former wife, Molly, she studied wolves for her master's degree. And the thing that her master's degree was on wolf denning habitat. And she had to crawl into wolf dens to measure them and all this stuff. And
Mm.
and she was giving testimony at one of these hearings about whether to restore wolves in Montana and Yellowstone. And these big bulky guys would get up, in their camo and stuff. Well, I'm worried about the wolves attacking me and out when I'm out there hunting and so forth. And you'd hear all these things. And so then my petite wife gets in there and says, "Well, I used to crawl in the wolf dens and I wasn't really afraid of them." And and I wrote an article about California wolf possibility for recovery years ago. And at that time I was a journalist, so I had to be non-advocate. But anyway, so I call up the livestock industry in California. I say, "Well, what do you guys think about having wolves back?" And, "Oh, we're really afraid they're going to attack our kids at the bus stop and all that kind of stuff, and they'll be killing kids and people all over the place." So then I called up the California Highway Department of Transportation. I said, "How many people get injured or killed by wolves? I mean, by cattle every year in California?" It was like 450 people. And so I made sure that in the article to say that the most dangerous thing in California was the livestock, not the potential for wolves. And that's a pretty accurate thing. I have, it can be, you can get the hair on the back of your neck rise up if you have wolves come in real close, as has happened to me. One time I was snowshoeing in the Canadian Rockies at night, and I kept thinking that I was being trailed. And I'd look around, I'd turn around and see shadows and look like they were moving and so forth. And finally, I couldn't take it anymore. And so I just decided I'm going to sleep on the trail. and let them get me if they're going to get me. But I went back in the morning, there were no wolf tracks. It was all my imagination. But I could swear I saw things darting around in the dark shadows. I was a little nervous about it. But anyway,
Yeah.
wolves are not usually a threat unless they get habituated to people. So that's the thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's a nice story to end at. Thanks for all your anecdotes, George. This has been really wonderful. Lots of people commenting in the chat, thanking you. So thanks everyone at home. Thank you to Restore for sponsoring this event, co-sponsoring this event with the Walden Woods Project. I put both of our donation links in the chat if anyone can or is able to donate to our nonprofits. We've been doing virtual events for free for a while now, so we would really appreciate it. But more than anything, thank you for showing up, and be sure to check both of our websites out for upcoming events. And thank you again so much, George. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And just remember, more national parks are good for wolves. So let's try to get some more in New England, and that'll be one way to ensure that wolves will recover there.
Awesome. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.